Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, perched on a lonely island in the San Francisco Bay, stood as America's harshest cage for the worst of the worst. In October 1959, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had already survived 7 years behind those cold, unrelenting walls, serving a 15-year sentence for a federal narcotics conspiracy. At age 54, Johnson was one of the roughly 260 inmates doing time on the Rock, a place where escape was fantasy, and where violence hummed just beneath the surface of imposed order. Since arriving in June 1953, Bumpy had carved out a silent but thunderous presence in the prison, not through fear, but through the unmistakable weight of earned respect. On the streets of Harlem, he'd been a crime boss commanding millions, outmaneuvering Italians in the underworld, and walking battlefields of blood and bullets with calm grace. Inside Alcatraz, that legacy followed him like armor. Other inmates, black, white, or otherwise, understood quickly that Bumpy wasn't just another convict doing a bid. He was a symbol. To many black prisoners, he was proof that intelligence, power, and pride could thrive even in cages designed to strip men of those very things. But in every system, someone always resists the order others accept. And at Alcatraz, a towering hate-fueled white prisoner named Eric Pollson refused to swallow Johnson's presence. To some, Pollson was just another violent inmate. To others, especially black prisoners, he was a monster with history inked in red and a soul soaked in hatred. He would soon discover in a single explosive moment that mocking Bumpy Johnson came at a cost no man, no matter how big or brutal, could afford. The tale that unfolded eventually solidified itself as legend, passed across prison walls with a mix of reverence and warning. 17 eyewitnesses, inmates who served during that storm of October 1959, would recount it over the years. Interviews conducted between 1965 and 1970 with these men would paint a picture of a cafeteria confrontation that froze time. It wasn't the gore that burned it into memory. Alcatraz had seen worse. No, this moment resisted being forgotten because of its ferocity, its precision, its message. A week's worth of tension snapped in just seconds. The arrogant predator who had spent days circling would find himself blind, bleeding and broken, not by sheer force, but by calculation born from patience. Eric Pollson, at 38, epitomized the kind of dangerous man Alcatraz had been built to hold. 6'4", 275 pounds of raw muscle, sculpted over years of prison workouts. Pollson wasn't just large, he was lethal. Sent away for murdering 3 black men in a string of armed robberies throughout Texas between 54 and 56, Pollson wore his hate on his sleeve. When prosecutors confronted him in court, he hadn't minced words. In his testimony, killing racial slur, that ain't murder, that's pest control. It wasn't bravado. He laughed when judges condemned him. He promised future killings if ever released. So, when he landed in Alcatraz in 1957 after repeated acts of violence against black inmates elsewhere, he came with a reputation dripping with venom. And he wasted no time showing prisoners that the venom was still alive, weaponized through calculated cruelty that, somehow, skirted enough of the rules to sidestep real punishment. According to Marcus Williams, a black inmate who served from 58 to 64 and witnessed what would later transpire, Pollson terrorized with theater. He knew exactly how far he could go, Williams said in a 1968 conversation. He was smart about being brutal. Pollson wouldn't always throw fists in broad daylight. He worked in subtle slams, food snatched off trays, painful accidental bumps in showers, slurs whispered a breath away from a guard's hearing. These weren't mindless acts. They were signals, reminders that he saw black prisoners as filth in his world. He told anyone who listened, including people in uniform, that Alcatraz was no place for racial slurs, that they didn't belong among real white criminals. Over 2 years, the fear of confronting Pollson metastasized through cell blocks. Even white inmates kept wide berths, not out of allegiance, but self-preservation. Guards, knowingly or not, allowed his cruelty to simmer. Some, it was whispered, shared his views. None stepped in forcefully. To many, Pollson was a fire best left alone. But then came Bumpy. And Pollson, swollen with pride, saw the respect shown to this older black man as an insult to his self-styled hierarchy. He'd dethroned dozens with beatings and threats. How could he sit silently while another racial slur, older, smaller, drew veneration he believed was his by terror? The first seeds of tension sprouted on Friday, October 16th in the cafeteria, lunchtime. Bumpy sat surrounded by 3 black inmates, calmly eating like any other day. Then came Pollson, tray in hand, stride slow and arrogant. As he passed Bumpy's table, he reached out, not even pausing, and took the slice of apple pie off Johnson's tray. Then, eyes locked with Bumpy, he sat at his table across the room and ate the pie slowly, deliberately, a silent performance of dominance. "Bumpy?" He glanced once at the empty spot on his tray, once at Pollson, then returned to eating quietly, unfazed. But the ripples shot down the table like electricity. "We were ready to fight right there," Williams recalled. "That was war." But Bumpy just slightly shook his head, told us with his eyes to stand down. Confused but obedient, they sat back. Was it fear? They didn't know. Not then. What they couldn't see was that Bumpy had just baited the line and the predator had bitten. 3 days passed. Then on Monday, October 19th, during communal showers, the next insult came. Johnson stood lathered under the spray when Pollson entered deliberately, ignoring all open stalls, marching straight toward him. With a shove, hard and calculated, he sent Bumpy stumbling back, catching himself on a slick wall to avoid slipping. "This, my shower, racial slur," Pollson growled loud enough for echoes. "Go find yours. This one's for white men." There was silence. Eyes turned. Bumpy rose to full posture, stared at him for seconds without a word, then simply moved to another stall and resumed his routine. Again the whispers. Was Bumpy scared? He hadn't raised a hand to the man who just cowited him into tile and insulted his ancestry. But some, those who knew the streets more than they feared sordid legends, began to understand. This wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. Then came Wednesday, October 21 in the yard. Clear skies, an hour outside, an uneasy calm. Johnson strolled calmly with 2 inmates when Pollson appeared, planting himself in the path like a wall of hatred. "Get out of my way, racial slur," he barked. "White men walk the straight line. You walk around." With quiet calm, Bumpy stepped aside and circled. Pollson, grinning like a wolf among sheep, shouted, "That's right, that's your place." Again, no retaliation, just low murmurs and tense breath. By nightfall, every cell was buzzing. Some thought Bumpy had lost his edge. Others waited. That night, Williams leaned into their shared cell space and asked the question pulsing through the block, "Why are you letting that man disrespect you like this?" Bumpy smiled, not kindly, not coldly, but like a man who had already decided the outcome and was just waiting for the clock. "He's hanging himself," Bumpy said. "The longer I wait, the more rope he wraps around his neck. He slips once more, and I don't go down for it. I go free." Thursday, October 22nd, the tension reached its breaking point. During the afternoon recreation period, Pollson found his next target, 23-year-old Robert Jackson, a quiet, bookish black inmate who'd been serving time for postal fraud. Jackson sat alone on a bench, lost in the pages of a novel, when Pollson strolled over like a storm in human form. "What are you reading, boy?" he snapped, snatching the book out of Jackson's hands with mock curiosity. He thumbed through it, then sneered. Didn't know racial slurs could read without pictures. Jackson, startled but polite, responded the only way he knew how. "Please, give that back, sir." "I was reading." But Pollson didn't return it. He slapped Jackson in the face with the book, a hard, humiliating strike that knocked the young man onto the ground. Then, as if sealing the insult, he hurled the book into a dirty puddle. Hovering over him, he spat another slur and said, "That's where you belong." Guards broke it up before it spiraled into further violence. But as always, the response was mild. Pollson lost a day of yard privileges. Jackson? He was treated for a split lip and a bloodied eye in the infirmary. That evening, something changed in Bumpy's demeanor. Less patience, more calculation sharpened to a point. Sitting quietly among a group of black inmates in their tier, he made a promise that echoed even before it was carried out. Tomorrow, at lunch, Pollson learns the cost of disrespect. He's mistaking restraint for fear. He thinks I'm done. But tomorrow, he finds out how wrong he is. Alcatraz's cafeteria, rigid and orderly, was not the place most men picked for retribution. It could seat over 250 inmates, all lined in rows under the ever-watchful eyes of armed guards. Fights during mealtime were common. Too many choke points, too many sight lines, and consequences far too severe. Every movement was visible, every shadow documented. For a man to pick that place for a violent act, he'd have to be careful, or confident, or both. At 12:15 p.m. on Friday, October 23rd, inmates moved in formation into the cafeteria. Johnson, unassuming as always, took his tray and seated himself at his assigned table alongside 3 others. He ate without fanfare as if it were any other day. 2 minutes later, Pollson appeared, but instead of heading to his table, he veered, walked directly toward Johnson's, placed his tray down across from him with a loud thud, and opened his mouth like a man certain there would be no consequences. "Well, look here," he said loud enough for 3 tables to hear. Harlem's racial slur, king, still holds his throne. Still eating with his little racial slur fans too, huh? Thinking you matter in here? Johnson didn't speak, didn't look up, kept eating. That quiet enraged Pollson more than any words would have. He leaned forward. "You ignoring me, boy?" he sneered. "Think you're too good to speak back when a white man talks?" He spat the next words like venom. "Let me explain something. You're a racial slur. That means you're beneath me. That means when I talk, you show respect or get taught how to." It wasn't enough for Pollson to come at Johnson. He couldn't help himself. He turned toward Robert Jackson, bruised and still healing, sitting 3 tables away. "Hey, boy," he shouted across the cafeteria, loud enough to bring tension rippling across the room. "How's that pretty face today? Still smarting from yesterday?" Jackson stared at his food, still as stone but shaking inside. He said nothing, but others around him glanced up, shifting in their seats. Several black inmates started to move, rising like a wave ready to defend. "Everybody sit down," a guard barked. Chairs scraped. Bodies hesitated. Then Bumpy stood, and the entire room held its breath. 17 men would swear under oath later that the entire thing took maybe 4 seconds. Bumpy rose smoothly, his hand moving toward his waistband, a small motion masked by the loose folds of his uniform. From beneath his shirt, tucked and hidden against his waist, appeared a blade no longer than 4 inches. Metal, forged into a weapon, sharp as justice, invisible until the moment it mattered. He stepped around the table, calm, fast, no hesitation. 8 feet between them vanished in seconds. Pollson wasn't expecting it. When he saw Bumpy coming, he began to rise. Just a second too late. He never had a chance. Bumpy moved like the years had peeled off his age. In one clean horizontal motion, the blade sliced across Pollson's face, left cheekbone to right jaw, deep, unforgiving, total. Blood poured instantly. The scream that tore from Pollson's throat was primal, but Bumpy didn't stop. Before guards could reach them, and before Pollson could even understand what had happened, a second slash carved diagonally across the first. This one caught his eye. Silenced depth with pain, tore skin, muscles, and optic tissue all at once. Pollson screamed louder, collapsing backward off the bench and hitting the ground hard. His hands immediately covered what had once been an eye, now just torn muscle bleeding freely into his shirt. Chaos erupted. Inmates ducked. Guards surged. Orders and whistles filled the room in waves. Silence shattered like glass. Within seconds, guards surrounded Johnson, weapons drawn, not out of surprise, but because they'd never moved that fast before. 2 other guards were already kneeling beside Pollson, who writhed and screamed, blood turning the floor sticky and dark. Bumpy let the blade fall, raised open hands, no resistance. They cuffed him roughly and pressed his body to the cold floor, and right before they dragged him out, he said it, one sentence louder than the sirens in every man's chest. Touch that young brother again. Call him that slur one more time. Next time you won't see no doctor. Next time you'll meet God. And with that, the myth was born. The man who just nearly killed someone with 2 precise movements spoke like a prophet, and every person in that room understood they'd just witnessed history. Pollson's wounds were catastrophic. The first slash required over 100 stitches, stitching together a face that would never fully form again. The second took his right eye completely. Surgeons tried to save it. Couldn't. He'd be blind on that side forever. His recovery would take 2 full weeks. His pride? That might have died on the cafeteria floor. They placed Bumpy immediately in solitary once the cleanup began. And while the puddle of blood was still being scrubbed from dining hall tiles, the talk spread fast. Not just what happened, but how everything had happened. 17 witnesses, multiple angles. Every man with a version matching the next. Each moment in the buildup had evidence, statements, cross-referencing. Pollson had taken Bumpy's food, had shoved him in the shower, blocked his path, issued slurs that rotted the very air they walked in. He'd hit Jackson, humiliated him, then came back for more just 24 hours later. And still, Bumpy hadn't struck first. He'd waited, chosen, then delivered violence so fast, so sharp, it looked choreographed. When the prison convened an internal investigation, witness after witness said the same thing. Yes, Bumpy used a weapon, but it wasn't random. It wasn't uncontrolled. And above all, it came only after threats had peaked and guards had looked the other way too many times. When investigators finally sat Bumpy down in that cold room to take his statement, he didn't posture, didn't grovel, didn't lie. His words were steady, deliberate, and unified in every retelling. I defended myself, and I defended another man. That inmate has been threatening us for over a week. I used the least force I thought was necessary to make him stop. I warned him. I told him afterward, if he came again, he'd meet God instead of a doctor. He told the truth because the truth, this time, was all Bumpy needed. The evidence, both spoken and scarred into Pollson's flesh, was already undeniable. He didn't have to prove a pattern of abuse. The entire cell block had seen it. He didn't need to justify the timing. Every man eating lunch that day knew something was coming. And now, finally, even Alcatraz itself had to acknowledge that the man they'd allowed to brutalize others had finally picked the wrong soul to challenge. 2 weeks passed while Bumpy sat in the holes, solitary confinement, no sunlight, no visitors, the same food every day passed through a slot in a locked steel door. But he didn't whisper complaints. He endured it like everything else calmly. Then came the prison's final ruling, and it surprised a lot of people. Yes, Johnson would be punished. He'd serve 30 days in solitary, not for the violence itself, but for the weapon. Carrying a shank, even in self-defense, was a violation. But there would be no added years to his sentence. Alcatraz wasn't willing to say it loud, but their actions spoke clearly. Pollson got what was coming. No one would say it in memos or hearings, but the truth moved in echoes through the guards and officers. They knew what the inmates knew. They'd seen Pollson get away with too much for too long. They'd seen him mock, humiliate, and injure with impunity. In some ways, Bumpy had done what nobody else could, or maybe what nobody else dared. Days after Bumpy re-entered the general population, Pollson was quietly moved to another facility. No announcements, no fanfare. Just gone. Transferred without trial, a message tucked between bureaucratic lines. Pollson wasn't just a racist thug, he was now a liability. No longer the dominant force he once thought himself to be. And ironically, that silence was the clearest admission of guilt that Alcatraz ever made. They didn't charge Bumpy with anything beyond what was unavoidable. They didn't add time to his sentence. They didn't even demand restitution or a formal hearing. They sent Pollson away and let Bumpy walk the same halls with his head held not high, but level. Because now everyone knew not to test him. And more importantly, they understood why. What happened that day in October, in the sterile metal and stone cafeteria, traveled far, way beyond Alcatraz's walls. The story walked out with every prisoner who transferred in the months following. It spread from cell block to cell block. Guards talked about it with one another in hushed tones. Administrators referred to it in security briefings as the Johnson incident, while inmates just called it the day. Word of what Bumpy did reached Atlanta, Leavenworth, Marion, crossing state lines not like gossip, but scripture, passed from mouth to mouth like truth that couldn't be contained. And with every telling, the story became more than just memory. It became legend, not only because of what Bumpy did, but how he did it. That's what stuck. Not raw violence. Alcatraz had bloodstains older than its walls. What stuck was the psychology, the patience, the chess-like setup. Bumpy didn't flinch on day one. He didn't retaliate in the moment. He waited, let the insults mount, let the bully grow arrogantly comfortable. He made sure every move Pollson made was seen, documented, recorded by the very prisoners who would later testify to justify what came next. Then, when the moment was perfect, he struck. Fast. Clean. 2 cuts in 3 seconds that disabled a monster before anyone else could even inhale. Then came the warning, a phrase so iconic it lit up cell blocks. Next time you'll visit God. It wasn't just a threat. It was a sentence, specific, final, true. How Bumpy got the weapon into the cafeteria. No one ever figured it out. And maybe that made it even scarier. It told people Bumpy didn't just understand violence, he mastered preparation. He knew how to slip a weapon past pat-downs, knew what day to do it, what hallway was safest to walk down, what pocket it belonged in, how to move undetected. And the rhythm of the strike? That wasn't random brutality. That was knowledge. That was Harlem experience. That was a reminder to everybody watching. Don't mistake age for weakness. Don't mistake silence for fear. The fact that Bumpy was 54 when he slashed a 38-year-old combat-built killer shook people. This wasn't youth versus age. This was domination through mental legacy, through experience, through situational control so perfect it made brute strength irrelevant. Legend grew and took root, and it wasn't built on fantasy. It was built on truth so sharp it carved its way into storytelling. In black barbershops and prison tiers, the moral became simple. Don't start fights with someone who's already finished planning the end. Especially not if that someone is Bumpy Johnson. For black inmates especially, the story wasn't just thrilling, it was symbolic. It was justice in an unjust place. A monster had been neutralized. A young man who couldn't fight back had been protected. And guards who looked the other way had been slapped with proof that sometimes silence carries consequences. If you're being harassed by someone bigger, the story whispered, carry yourself like Bumpy. Wait, watch. Then strike when it's time and leave no doubt in your resolve. As the 30 days passed and Bumpy emerged from the hole, the shift within Alcatraz was undeniable. The air felt different. Conversations quieted when he passed. Many of the white prisoners who once freely tossed slurs in earshot began holding their tongues. Even the boldest guards spoke with more wariness. No one wanted to be the next miscalculation. And among the young, the unsure, and the vulnerable, something stronger than fear took root: respect. Bumpy had taken that blade for Robert Jackson, had risked solitary, risked years of added time, not for money, not for power, for principle. That carried weight, that created protection not just for him, but for every black inmate who'd ever eyed Pollson warily from across the yard. Robert Jackson, the soft-spoken 23-year-old whose only crime had been forging checks, would never forget what happened that day in the cafeteria. His body trembled with the remnants of fear when he saw Pollson target him again, but that fear melted the second Bumpy stood up. In that moment, Jackson realized someone was willing to bleed, maybe even die, on his behalf. And that kind of gesture carved something into a man forever. Jackson would go on to serve the remainder of his sentence, quietly, respectfully, and with his eyes wide open to the world around him. But what Bumpy did that day stayed with him long after the cell doors closed behind him for the last time. He told friends and family years later that the act had reshaped how he saw bravery and justice. "Mr. Johnson saved me," Jackson once told his sister, "not just from Pollson, but from thinking survival meant silence. As for the attackers, He never saw Bumpy again, but Jackson carried a clipping of Bumpy's obituary in his wallet until his death, and tucked beside it was a handwritten note dated 1962. "He saved me when no one else would. He showed me what courage looks like." Pollson, meanwhile, was transferred to USP Leavenworth 2 months after the attack. He didn't walk out of Alcatraz. He was removed, medically cleared, but permanently changed. His face carried the rage of that confrontation. A jagged scar ran from cheek to jaw like a gruesome badge. His right eye would never return, and in losing sight, he seemed to lose his edge. In Leavenworth, he didn't carry the same swagger. No more slurs thrown out like knives. No more stolen food or walking too close in the yard. He kept to himself, quieter, not quite broken, but dented where fear had finally sunk in. Inmates who met him there would later say that Pollson had been burned from the inside out. The hate was still there, but now it was quieter. Muted, like a snarling dog that had tasted its own blood and now growled from a safe distance. He completed his sentence quietly and was released in 1971, returning to Texas where he labored in construction and lived in near anonymity. Those who knew him remember he never liked to talk about prison, but sometimes he touched the scar on his face and mutter, "I thought I was the baddest man inside. Turns out, I didn't even know what bad was." Bumpy Johnson, after finishing his 30 days in solitary, returned to Alcatraz's general population a legend, the kind of legend that doesn't require boasting or reminders because the proof traveled ahead of him at the volume of whispered awe. Nobody took his fruit again. Nobody accidentally bumped him in common areas. Nobody used slurs around him because nobody wanted to carry the kind of mark Pollson did. Even the guards, those normally indifferent sentinels of steel and silence, addressed Bumpy with more restraint. Not friendliness. This was still prison, but the kind of respect that comes from mutual recognition of power. He remained in Alcatraz for another 4 years, walking the halls not as a king parading a crown, but as a storm that had already passed and left enough destruction that no one wished to summon it again. And that reputation didn't just protect Bumpy, it radiated outward like armor for every black inmate inside those same walls. Pollson had been the worst, the most dangerous, but he hadn't been the only problem. Bumpy's act had drawn a line in the concrete, a new boundary, a warning. If you push too far, someone might make you remember your limits. In the year that followed, slurs became fewer, incidents dropped, the air changed, not because racism vanished, it didn't, but because one man made it clear that being black didn't mean being prey. That calm wasn't always compliance. That silence sometimes stands shoulder to shoulder with thunder waiting. And when Bumpy walked through the yard or took a seat in the cafeteria again, younger inmates watched him, not just in fear, but hope. A reminder that strength wears many forms, that justice, in places designed to grind men down, can take root and grow strong in the right soil. Bumpy would finish his time at Alcatraz and secure release in November of 1963. 10 years served. Within weeks, he was back in Harlem, back to building, back to claiming the empire he'd left behind. He never publicly spoke about the incident with Pollson, never glorified it, never cashed in on the attention, but prison men talked. Former Alcatraz inmates wrote letters across the system. The story rippled with weight and pride, especially among the black community who'd heard rumors of the infamous Cafeteria Day. Not because of the violence itself, but the reason for it, the calculation, the courage, the code. When Bumpy died of a heart attack in 1968, 5 years after walking free, not everyone knew the full scope of the legacy he left behind. But inside those walls, among the men who remembered, and among the ones who'd only heard through echo, what he did to Pollson stood taller than a street empire ever could. Marcus Williams, who had stood by Bumpy's side at Alcatraz and remained connected after release, spoke plainly years later. He was a man they already respected, but after that day, he was a legend. There's power, and then there's controlled power. Bumpy wasn't feared because he snapped. He was feared because he waited, because he knew when it meant something. He didn't just fight back. He finished the threat, and did it so fast, so clean, Pollson didn't even realize he'd been beat until he bled through the moment. That legacy, restraint, followed by precision, became gospel. In cell blocks and holding pens, whispered over cards or between bars, men would use one line like a psalm: "Touch a brother again, and you'll visit God." The phrase was no longer just Bumpy's. It belonged to everyone who saw themselves waiting for a moment, quiet, cornered, underestimated, and needed a weapon made of words to draw their own line. The cafeteria slice, the event that took 3 seconds to unfold but would stretch across decades in memory, carved more than skin. It sliced into the myth of invincibility. It exposed the lie that bullies couldn't fall. That size was protection. That hate could be shouted without response. And it elevated Bumpy Johnson from criminal to something closer to legend, not because of violence, but because of how he carried it, not recklessly, not randomly, but with intent, with a strategy born from Harlem streets and sharpened in 4 decades of surviving systems built to erase him. He wasn't explosive, he was surgical. He didn't lash out, he executed. 2 slashes, 1 sentence, and a moment that tightened throat muscles all the way from that island to dozens of facilities beyond. That slice in the cafeteria wasn't just about one man hurting another. It became a story told in every prison across the country. It became scripture in places where silence was survival and violence was currency. Through mouths of inmates transferred to facilities far from Alcatraz, the story lived on. Guards spoke about it in passing, some with disbelief, others with quiet admiration. Prison officials wrote summaries and reports trying to strip the emotion and legend from it, but it never worked. Word of what happened passed from corner to corner, whispered from mentor to rookie, and became a foundational lesson: be smart, be patient, and never underestimate the quietest man in the room. Bumpy Johnson, already feared and respected for everything he had built in Harlem, now stood as something else entirely, an icon whose name could shake a room without anyone needing to raise a voice. The element of that day that stuck the most wasn't how Pollson fell. It was how Johnson waited. He endured a week of repeated humiliation, not because he couldn't react sooner, but because he saw the bigger picture. Saw how violence used too early can backfire, how power meant knowing when to play helpless, only to strike with righteous fury. 2 slashes in 3 seconds. Both devastating, both permanent. Nobody else even had time to move. That kind of control to speed and precision became the definition of authority in the prison world, and what made it more unforgettable was the mystery of the weapon itself. No one ever figured out how Bumpy got the blade inside, nor how he hid it from the pre-meal searches that were typical at Alcatraz. That mystery fueled the legend further. He hadn't just been fast, he'd been prepared. He moved like someone who had calculated every possible reaction, knowing exactly what would unfold down to the heartbeat. That level of control created something rarer than fear-awe. And then there was the line, that one chilling sentence that echoed louder than any scream Pollson made that day: "Next time you'll visit God." It wasn't said with rage. It was said with clarity, with the weight of absolute certainty. And that's why it stuck. It was final. It wasn't a warning. It was a guarantee. Prisoners shared that quote like scripture, trading it the way soldiers pass down knowledge of war. You don't mess with someone who speaks like that after just shattering another man permanently. That small sentence became symbolic, used by inmates who felt cornered by threats, who couldn't draw a weapon but needed a phrase that punched like a blade. In cell blocks from Louisiana to Illinois, it became shorthand for something sacred, that final invisible line you cross at your own peril. The age factor made the story even more haunting. Bumpy Johnson was 54 years old when he attacked Pollson. He wasn't lifting weights in the yard or showing off his strength. He looked, to some, like time had softened him. But what happened proved that strength isn't always visible, that sometimes it hides in stillness, in patience, in wisdom grown from years of navigating chaos. Pollson was younger, larger, sharp-edged, and arrogant from years of domination, and yet, within seconds, the man who looked more like someone's worn neighbor had taken him apart like soft tissue. It flipped the narrative upside down. Youth didn't win. Size didn't win. The man with strategy did. The man willing to look weak so he could strike when it mattered. And that reversal of roles became part of the story's backbone. Within a year, the legend of Alcatraz's Cafeteria reached every major federal prison in America. Not just the story, but the aura of it. In Atlanta, men spoke quietly about the way Bumpy stood up, without raising his voice. At Leavenworth, they whispered about the diagonal slash that stole an eye in a blink. At Marion, they passed down exact quotes from Marcus Williams, how Bumpy planned every move, waited patiently, and finished it in under 5 seconds. Among black inmates especially, the story spread like gospel, not just in admiration, but in warning. It told every man cornered by racism and hate, remember what Bumpy did. You don't have to fight every time, but if you must fight, make it the last time anyone picks on you. When Bumpy walked the yards after emerging from solitary, the energy changed around him. Guards treated him as someone they couldn't afford to ignore, not out of camaraderie but calculation. If this man had weaponized intelligence and precision once, he could do it again. White inmates who once casually threw on slurs near him now kept mouths shut or turned corners. Respect hovered around him like armor, unspoken but present. And for younger black inmates, they watched him like a prophet cloaked in prison cloth. He didn't lecture, but just his presence taught them what dignity looked like when wrapped in restraint. Because Bumpy hadn't carved open Pollson to boost his ego, he did it to end a reign of terror that no one else would challenge. Nobody even considered messing with Bumpy after that. He wasn't feared for being unpredictable. He was feared for being exact, a blade carved from patience. The kind of threat that doesn't shout from rooftops but whispers in your ear and changes your skull forever. He carried that respect for his remaining years at Alcatraz, saying little, moving more like a shadow than a man. But everyone knew. He had proven that brains beat brawn. That strategy sliced deeper than strength. That sometimes intelligence mixed with violence wasn't chaos, it was chess. And nobody wanted to be the next piece he took off the board. Robert Jackson walked out of Alcatraz in 1962, released back into a world that hadn't gotten much kinder. But he carried with him something more enduring than fear. He carried belief in protection, in brotherhood, in quiet strength that erupts only when it's truly called. He lived the rest of his life peacefully and passed away decades later. And when they found the clipping of Bumpy's death in his wallet, it's when they realized that what happened in that cafeteria reshaped his very worldview. The note, dated the year after the attack, was brief, but it said everything. He saved me when no one else would. He showed me what courage looks like. RJ, 1962. Pollson never returned to Alcatraz. After moving to Leavenworth in December of '59, he served his time like a ghost of who he'd been. Gone was the thunder. Gone was the assaults. He worked small jobs, moved through cell blocks like a man who didn't recognize his reflection. He left prison in 1971, lived quietly in Texas doing construction and maintenance jobs, passed away in 1989 at 68 years old. People in town said he spoke little, but when he did talk about prison, he'd sometimes touch that scar on his face and say, "I learned the hard way. Being big don't make you dangerous. Being dangerous don't mean you're smart. I thought I was the baddest man in Alcatraz. I wasn't even close." And as for Bumpy Johnson, after walking out of Alcatraz in November 1963 with 10 years served, he returned to Harlem and picked up where he left off, still powerful, still respected, still dressed sharp and measured in every word. He lived another 5 years before a heart attack took him in 1968, but what he left behind in that prison lasted long beyond his body. That cafeteria moment, those 2 perfect cuts, that cold promise, that walk back into general population without another word, became part of the mythology. It defined his legacy more than anything on the streets ever did, because behind bars, respect is survival. And Bumpy didn't just earn it, he redefined it. That single line, "Next time you'll visit God," became legend. A line used by inmates in moments when warnings needed weight. A line passed between generations as a reminder of what precision looks like in the hands of the prepared. And the moment itself, the blood on white uniforms, the stunned silence in a room usually humming with cruelty, remained a legend not just because it was violent, but because of its truth. Never assume the smallest, oldest man can't change your life in 3 seconds. Never forget what happens when a bully picks the one person who already made peace with what must be done. That day didn't belong to rage, it belonged to strategy, to patience turned into steel. That was October 23rd, 1959. That was the day a man named Eric Pollson discovered just how much damage a single wrong target could do. In 3 seconds, in 2 deep cuts, Bumpy Johnson made certain that every inmate in the country would know respect isn't taken, it's earned. And once earned, it is enforced. Some stories stay locked behind bars, but others break free, not through escape, but through legacy. What Bumpy Johnson did in that cafeteria wasn't just a moment of violence. It was a message carved into time. It was a reminder that silence isn't always weakness, that the quietest voice can carry the sharpest warning, that in a world built to strip dignity away, one man stood up, not just for himself, but for someone who couldn't stand alone. And in doing so, he changed not just one life, but thousands of lives across decades. That's not just a story from Alcatraz. That's history. That's legend. That's the day a bully met his match and lost more than just his eye. If you were in that cafeteria witnessing everything unfold, what would you have done if you were in Bumpy's place? Waited, fought back, or tried something else? Tell us in the comments. We're listening. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't let it end here. Like this video to keep legends like this alive. Subscribe for more untold stories of resistance, courage, and respect in the darkest of places. And share it with someone who should know who Bumpy Johnson really was.